Westbrook High School buzzed with its usual morning chaos. Lockers slammed shut like gunshots echoing through the corridors. Sneakers squeaked against polished floors, creating a symphony of teenage energy. Students rushed between classes, their voices blending into a constant hum of conversation and laughter. Bright motivational posters lined the walls, proclaiming messages about respect, tolerance, and friendship. But these colorful displays had become invisible wallpaper, their noble words forgotten in the daily struggle of adolescent survival. Among the flowing crowd moved Leah Van Damme, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail that swayed gently with each careful step. She carried her books pressed tightly against her chest like a shield, walking with the practiced invisibility of someone who had learned that silence was safety. Her footsteps were measured, never too fast, never drawing attention. She had mastered the art of blending into backgrounds, of slipping through hallways unnoticed. Most students at Westbrook had no idea who her father was. They didn't know that Jean-Claude Van Damme, the legendary martial artist whose movies had thrilled millions worldwide, was a man who tucked her in at night and helped with homework. Leah never spoke about it. She didn't want to be known as a famous guy's daughter. She craved normalcy, anonymity, the simple pleasure of being just another student worried about history essays and algebra tests. Where her father commanded attention with his presence, Leah preferred shadows. Where he was bold and confident, she was gentle and cautious. She found comfort in her books, her sketches, her quiet thoughts. Her notebooks were filled with small drawings and personal mantras she had written to give herself strength. "Stand tall even in the storm" was her favorite, scrawled in the margins between math problems. But at Westbrook High, quietness was often mistaken for weakness. In the cruel ecosystem of teenage hierarchy, gentle souls like Leah became targets for those who confused intimidation with power. Predators in leather jackets and expensive sneakers could smell vulnerability from across a crowded cafeteria. The morning started like any other until the atmosphere shifted. Conversations died mid-sentence. Laughter faded into nervous whispers. The natural flow of students suddenly developed gaps, like a river avoiding rocks. At the far end of the corridor appeared Trevor Hayes, his broad shoulders cutting through the crowd like the prow of a ship. He walked with the swagger of someone who believed the school belonged to him. Trevor's entourage followed behind him, their loyalty bought with reflected glory and the promise of protection from becoming targets themselves. They laughed too loudly at his jokes, their eyes constantly seeking his approval. Students instinctively pressed themselves against lockers as Trevor passed, suddenly finding urgent reasons to examine their shoelaces or dig through backpacks. Leah noticed the change too late. She was standing near her locker, lost in thought about a history presentation, when the corridor fell silent around her. She looked up to see Trevor's predatory grin already focused on her, his course changing with the casual cruelty of a shark selecting prey. Well, what do we have here?" Trevor's voice boomed across the hallway, causing heads to turn and phones to emerge from pockets. His friends flanked him like wolves, eager for the entertainment they knew was coming. "Jean-Claude Van Damme's little girl. Do you kick as hard as your daddy, or are you just hiding behind his name?" The cruel laughter from his friends echoed off the walls, bouncing back like mockery multiplied. Leah felt her cheeks burn with shame, but she kept her eyes down, pressing her books tighter against her chest. She had learned that silence sometimes worked, that bullies often grew bored when denied a reaction. She tried to walk past him, but Trevor shifted smoothly, his shoulder checking her with practiced precision. The impact sent her books flying, papers scattering across the polished floor like autumn leaves in a sudden wind. His friends erupted in laughter, the sound sharp and hungry. "Oops," Trevor said with mock innocence, his smirk revealing the calculated nature of his cruelty. "Guess you're clumsy just like you're weak." Leah dropped to her knees, frantically gathering her scattered papers. Her fingers trembled as she reached for a sketch that had escaped from a notebook, one that bore her personal motto about standing tall in storms. Trevor noticed it immediately, his eyes narrowing with interest. "What's this?" he asked, bending down to get a better look. "Little motivational quotes from Mommy and Daddy." The mockery in his voice cut deeper than the physical assault. As Leah tried to collect her belongings, Trevor's foot came down hard on one of her textbooks, pinning it to the floor. The sound of rubber against paper was sharp and final, like a judge's gavel. Around them, a circle of students began to form. Phones rose like periscopes, recording every moment of humiliation. Some whispered nervously among themselves, but no one stepped forward to help. The unspoken rule of high school survival was clear. Better to be a witness than the next victim. The hallway had transformed into a coliseum, with Leah trapped at its center. Trevor's foot remained planted on her book like a flag claiming conquered territory. The circle of students pressed closer, their phones glowing like electronic eyes, recording every second of her degradation. The sound of their breathing seemed amplified in the sudden stillness, broken only by the occasional nervous shuffle of sneakers against tile. "Pick it up," Trevor commanded, not moving his foot an inch. His voice carried the casual authority of someone who had never been denied, never faced consequences for his actions. The smirk on his face had evolved from theatrical to genuinely sinister. Leah's fingers hovered over the book, trembling despite her efforts to maintain composure. She tried to remember her father's lessons about breathing, about finding calm in chaos. In for 4 count, out for 6. It was a technique that had helped her through stage fright before class presentations, but here it felt inadequate against the storm of humiliation surrounding her. She reached for the book, and Trevor lifted his foot just enough to give her hope before slamming it down again. The crowd erupted in laughter, the sound bouncing off lockers like ricocheting bullets. Leah's knuckles went white as she gripped her remaining books tighter. "Told you," one of Trevor's friends snorted. "She doesn't even talk. Big-time martial artist for a dad, and she can't even stand up for herself. Maybe she only does autographs." "Hey, Leah," another chimed in with mock sweetness. "Sign my shoe." Trevor grew bored with the book and shifted his attention to her backpack. He caught the strap with 2 fingers, testing it like a guitarist checking tension on a string. When Leah flinched, his smirk widened. He yanked hard, and the strap tore over her shoulder. The bag hit the floor with a thud, its zipper bursting open like a wound. Everything spilled at once in a cascade of personal items. Textbooks fanned out across the tiles. Pens skittered away like frightened insects. A spiral notebook flipped open, its pages fluttering frantically. A small tube of lip balm rolled until someone's sneaker stopped it cold. In the center of the scattered debris lay 2 items that made Leah's heart sink. A keychain shaped like tiny boxing gloves, red leather worn smooth from years of being touched for courage, and a photograph in a clear protective sleeve. The picture showed a younger Leah smiling up at her father while he looked straight at the camera with that calm, unshakable confidence the world recognized. Trevor's hand shot toward the photo before Leah could react. He held it high like a trophy, turning slowly so every phone could capture the moment. "Look at this, everybody. Family portrait. The legend and his little shadow." "Please," Leah whispered, the word escaping before she could swallow it back. "Let me have it." Her plea sounded small and desperate in her own ears, even smaller in the hostile silence of the crowd. Trevor lowered the photo as if he might return it, then let it slip from his fingers. As Leah lunged forward, relief flaring briefly, his sneaker came down first. The clear sleeve squealed under rubber, its edges grinding against the tile. The photograph beneath smeared, her father's face caught under the tread like a promise being broken. The sound Leah made wasn't quite a cry. It was a sharp intake of breath that caught on something jagged in her chest. That photograph had lived in her bag since middle school. Through every day she felt invisible, and every day she wished she had been. Seeing it destroyed on the school floor was like watching hope itself being crushed. Trevor lifted his foot with theatrical gentleness, as if kindness after cruelty somehow mattered. He flicked the damaged sleeve toward her with his toe, laughing. "Not as tough as he looks on the poster, is he?" Leah snatched the photo and pulled it against her chest, the damaged plastic rough against her palm. She tried to find her father's rhythm, his control, but Trevor was already moving again. He knelt and scooped up a spiral notebook, flipping through it with damp fingers that left smudges on her careful handwriting. No one should stand alone, he read in a sing-song voice that made the words sound foolish. Justice, fairness, listen even when it's hard. He stretched the last word until it frayed like old rope. That's adorable. You're going to change the world with bullet points. His friends howled with laughter, the sound blooming and then thinning as it traveled through the ring of uncertain witnesses. A girl near the lockers bit her lip and stared at the floor. A boy in a varsity jacket shuffled uncomfortably but kept his eyes on his phone screen instead of the scene. The notebook contained more than just her writing. Trevor found her doodles, those private sketches she drew when her mind was too loud, little braces of thought, a pair of feet planted firmly, a line meant to represent a horizon. Her stomach twisted at seeing those intimate scratches exposed in his careless hands. "Stand tall even in the storm," he read from one margin, his voice dripping with mockery. "Sweet. Well, here's your storm." He snapped the notebook shut and tossed it carelessly. It skidded across the floor, spinning left with its pages bending beneath themselves. As Leah lunged to save it, Trevor's foot landed on the cover before her fingers could reach it. This time his placement was cleaner, more practiced, as if he had done this dance many times before. The pressure of his shoe created a perfect crease across the cover, marking her private thoughts with his dominance. Around them, the circle tightened like a noose, and Leah began to understand that this was only the beginning of something far worse than scattered books and torn photographs. The weight of Trevor's foot on Leah's notebook felt heavier than physics could explain. It wasn't just paper and cardboard being pressed against cold tile. It was a dignity, her privacy, her sense of safety being ground under rubber and arrogance. The corridor had become a theater, and everyone present understood their role in this cruel performance. "Pick it up," Trevor repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet that somehow carried more threat than any shout. His balance was perfect, all his weight poised on the ball of his foot as if it could stand there forever, crushing her words beneath his soul. Leah tried again to slide the notebook free, her fingers scraping against the tile as she pulled. Trevor pressed harder, and she could hear the spine beginning to crack under the pressure. Somewhere to her right, someone cleared their throat nervously. On her left, someone whispered, "Dude, chill," but the words died without echo or response. The crowd had grown thicker, more phones had appeared, and the air itself seemed to thicken with anticipation. What had started as casual cruelty was evolving into something darker, more calculated. Trevor leaned forward, his shadow swallowing her hands as she struggled with a trapped notebook. "What's it like?" he asked, his voice pitched low but loud enough for everyone to hear. "To wake up every day knowing you'll never be him? To carry his name like a shield you're too weak to lift?" The words hit harder than any physical blow could have. They found every insecurity she had ever hidden, every doubt she had ever wrestled with in the dark hours before sleep. Leah kept her gaze fixed on her fingers and the gray tile, afraid that if she looked up, he would see how deeply his cruelty had cut. Trevor released the pressure on the notebook so suddenly that Leah stumbled forward, off balance from her efforts to pull it free. Before she could catch herself, his hand shut to the front of her jacket and yanked her upward. Her shoulder blades hit the lockers with a metallic slap that echoed down the corridor and back again. He pinned her there with his forearm braced under her collarbones, not crushing yet but promising that he could. The cold metal bled through her jacket and shirt, chilling her skin. She could feel each rib expand against the barrier of his arm as her breathing grew shallow and quick. Leah raised her hands to press against his sleeve, not clawing or hitting, just trying to create space, to remind him that there were lines that shouldn't be crossed. But Trevor leaned in closer, stealing even that small freedom. "Look at me when I talk to you," he commanded. She kept her eyes fixed on the shoulder seam of his hoodie, counting stitches because numbers provided anchor when words failed. 1, 2, 3. His forearm pressed higher, restricting her breathing. 4, 5. The numbers began to slip. 6. Against her will, she looked up. What she saw in his eyes wasn't anger or even hatred. It was worse. It was pleasure. He was enjoying this power, feeding off her fear and the attention of the crowd. This wasn't about teaching her a lesson or establishing dominance. This was entertainment, and she was the unwilling star of his show. "Say it," he murmured, his face so close she could smell the artificial sweetness of his gum mixing with something sharper, the scent of adrenaline and cruelty. "Tell me to stop." Leah's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. Her throat worked around the word stop, as if there were hooks embedded in the syllables. The crowd leaned in unconsciously, drawn by the raw intimacy of domination, even as some part of them recognized they were witnessing something that had crossed a line. Trevor's smile had nothing to do with humor. It was the expression of someone who had discovered he could take whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted it. "Thought so," he said, and his palm moved to cup her throat. At first, it wasn't a squeeze, just the broad heat of his hand announcing ownership. But the threat was unmistakable. Leah's fingers shut to his wrist, digging in as if she could unhook him from her skin. She could feel his pulse beating against her thumb, steady and strong while her own heartbeat hammered frantically against her ribs. The first real pressure stole a thread of air. The second bent that thread in half. A ripple of unease moved through the watching crowd. Even those with phones raised began to lower them, as if the lenses might somehow carry guilt back to them through the glass. "Hey!" Someone whispered from the back of the circle. Another voice said, "He's going too far." Shoes shifted on tile, but no one stepped forward. The notification ping of a text message sounded, and then disappeared into the thick silence like a stone dropped in deep water. Leah's breath thinned to something barely recognizable as air. She tried her father's counting technique again. In for 4, out for 6, but there was no 4 to breathe in, no 6 to breathe out. Panic transformed her body into a house with all the doors locked from the inside. Her knees buckled and caught. Her fingers lost their grip on Trevor's wrist and slipped down to her sides, too heavy to hold up anymore. The world began to narrow, not gradually like a dimmer switch, but like a funnel forcing everything she could see into the single point of his grip around her throat. Trevor's friends had stopped laughing entirely. Their mouths hung half open as if the punchline had jammed in their throats. A girl near the front lowered her phone completely, her face pale as paper. The boy in the varsity jacket took half a step forward, then glanced at Trevor's supporters and took the half step back. "Look at all of you," Trevor said, his eyes flicking sideways to address his audience even as his grip tightened. "The Legends kid, and she's paper-thin." Leah's vision began to fracture. The edges of the corridor dissolved into soft black static. She heard her own heartbeat slam into her ears, skip, then slam again. Her body's desperate attempt to pull in oxygen felt like drowning in reverse, suffocating in open air. She thought of the photograph crushed minutes earlier, of the tiny crease that had folded across her father's cheek. She pictured herself standing tall like she had written in her notebook, but the floor tilted and her legs refused to support her anymore. The last coherent thought she had was wondering whether she would slide down the locker face or simply drop when her body finally gave up the fight. The world around Leah had dissolved into fragments of sensation and memory. Trevor's hand at her throat had become her entire universe, a ring of pressure that was slowly squeezing away not just air but consciousness itself. Her legs trembled like a building in an earthquake, ready to collapse completely. The distant voices of the crowd sounded like they were coming from underwater, muffled and strange. She was dimly aware that the laughter had died completely. Even Trevor's most loyal friends shifted uneasily, sensing that their leader had pushed beyond the boundaries of acceptable cruelty into something darker and more dangerous. The phones that had been eagerly recording moments before now hung heavy in uncertain hands. And then, beneath the suffocating silence, came a new sound. It started so quietly that it almost disappeared beneath the hum of fluorescent lights and the shuffle of nervous sneakers. But it grew clearer with every passing second. Footsteps, slow and steady, each one landing with a weight that seemed to resonate through the building's bones. They weren't loud, but they carried an authority that made every person in the corridor instinctively straighten their spine. Trevor's grip faltered slightly as he turned his head toward the sound. Even through the haze clouding her vision, Leah felt the shift in atmosphere. She forced her eyes open, her sight blurred and edged with encroaching darkness, and caught movement at the far end of the hallway. The crowd began to part without conscious thought, shoulders pressing into lockers, conversations dying mid-syllable. Some primal instinct demanded they make way for what was coming. Through the shifting mass of students walked a figure that commanded attention without seeking it, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with a kind of controlled grace that spoke of decades spent mastering both body and mind. Jean-Claude Van Damme had arrived, and his presence filled the space like an approaching thunderstorm. He didn't stride quickly or raise his voice. He didn't need to. The controlled power in his steps was more commanding than any scream could have been. This was a man of legend, but he wasn't here as an action hero or martial arts icon. He was here as a father who had discovered his daughter in mortal danger. His eyes, sharp and unwavering, locked onto the boy whose hand still clutched his daughter's throat. In that gaze was the accumulated weight of a lifetime spent disciplining mind and body, of training that had forged him into something beyond ordinary human limits. But beneath the legendary composure burned something far more dangerous than any movie villain had ever faced, parental fury refined by perfect control. Trevor swallowed hard, his bravado cracking like ice under pressure. The smirk that had seemed permanently etched on his face twitched and broke, replaced by the first flicker of genuine uncertainty he had shown. The boy who had ruled these halls with teenage arrogance suddenly looked very small against the force that had entered his domain. "Let her go!" Van Damme's voice cut through the silence with surgical precision. He didn't shout or threaten. He didn't need volume when every syllable carried the weight of absolute authority. The words rolled through the hallway like steel wrapped in velvet, commanding obedience without effort. For a moment, Trevor didn't move, as if testing whether the authority in that voice was real or some trick of acoustics. His fingers remained around Leah's throat, but the tremor in his hand betrayed his growing fear. He looked down at her pale face, then back up at the legend now only feet away. The decision was made for him. Leah's body went limp as consciousness finally slipped away, and Trevor released her in shock. She collapsed forward, her knees hitting the tile hard, gasping desperately as they rushed back into her starved lungs. The sound was painful, like fire burning through her chest, but it was the most beautiful sound her father had ever heard. Van Damme's gaze flickered to his daughter for just a heartbeat, long enough to confirm she was breathing, before returning to Trevor with laser focus. He took one measured step forward. The sound of his heel against the polished tile was louder than thunder in the absolute silence. Trevor stumbled backward instinctively, bumping into one of his own friends, who quickly stepped away as if cowardice might be contagious. The swagger that had carried him through years of unopposed bullying drained from his posture like water from a broken dam. "You think strength is about crushing someone weaker?" Van Damme asked, his voice still calm, every word deliberate and weighted. "You think it makes you powerful to choke a girl while your friends watch and laugh?" Trevor opened his mouth, searching for the words that had always come so easily when he was the one in control. Nothing emerged but a strangled sound that might have been an attempt at speech. His throat bobbed as he tried to swallow the lump of fear that had risen there. Another step. Another. Van Damme moved like flowing water, each stride smooth and measured but somehow inevitable. His presence seemed to bend the very air around him, creating a sphere of tension that made every witness lean forward despite their fear. In desperation, Trevor shoved Leah aside, her weakened body stumbling across the tile as he tried to create distance between himself and the approaching legend. It was a move of a coward, using her as a shield, but it gained him nothing because Van Damme was already there. His hand shot out with speed that defied human perception, fingers wrapping around Trevor's wrist with the precision of a striking serpent. The boy yelped, his remaining bravado shattering like glass against stone. In one fluid motion that combined decades of training with paternal rage, Van Damme pivoted his body, pulling Trevor forward and off balance. His hip dropped, his stance lowered, and in an instant that seemed to stretch forever, Trevor's feet left the ground. The throw was perfect, clean, efficient, devastating. Trevor's body flailed helplessly through the air before his back crashed against the unforgiving tile with a sound like thunder that silenced even breathing in the corridor. But Van Damme wasn't finished. He maintained his grip, dropping into a controlled crouch and twisting Trevor's wrist into a hold that sent sharp pain radiating through the boy's arm without breaking bone. Trevor writhed on the floor, his face contorted with shock and agony, every ounce of his former arrogance stripped away in seconds. The legend had reduced him to nothing, and everyone present understood they were witnessing something that would change the balance of power at Westbrook High forever. Trevor's body twisted against the cold tile, his wrist caught in Van Damme's iron grip like a mouse in the jaws of a patient cat. The whimper that escaped his throat was sharp and desperate, a sound that cut through the suffocating silence of the corridor. His swagger was gone, his arrogance stripped away by a single fluid motion that had left him sprawled and helpless on the floor where he had once strutted like a king. The students who had cheered his cruelty now stared with wide, shocked eyes. Their phones hung forgotten in trembling hands, no longer weapons of humiliation but silent witnesses to justice served. No one laughed. No one even breathed loudly enough to break the spell that had fallen over Westbrook High's hallways. Van Damme crouched low beside the broken bully, his posture relaxed but radiating controlled power. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority mixed with something more dangerous, disappointed restraint. "You thought strength was about crushing someone smaller," he said, his word precise as surgical instruments. "About humiliating them to make yourself feel tall. That's not strength, Trevor. That's a behavior of a coward who has never faced real consequences." Trevor tried to look away, but Van Damme's presence was inescapable. The legend leaned closer, forcing eye contact, making sure every word found its mark. "Real strength is discipline. It is control. It is a choice to protect those who cannot protect themselves, not to harm them for entertainment. His voice grew quieter, more dangerous. It is having the power to destroy someone and choosing mercy instead. A murmur rippled through the assembled students like wind through wheat. Some shifted uncomfortably as they remembered their own silence, their own complicity in what had nearly become tragedy. The shame was thick in the air, settling on shoulders like a heavy blanket. Van Damme increased pressure on Trevor's wrist just enough to make his point crystal clear, then release him with a casual indifference one might show a discarded tissue. Trevor slumped against the lockers, clutching his arm, his face pale and slick with sweat. The boy who had commanded fear and respect through cruelty now looked smaller than the girl he had tormented. Rising to his full height, Van Damme turned his attention to the crowd. His gaze swept across their faces like a searchlight, and where it touched, heads lowered in shame. "All of you watched," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hallway. "You whispered, you laughed, you recorded everything on your phones. And when his hand was around her throat, when she was losing consciousness, you did nothing." The words fell like hammer blows on anvil, each one striking sparks of guilt in young hearts. A girl near the front slipped her phone into her pocket with shaking hands. A boy in a varsity jacket tried to disappear into his own shadow, unable to meet the legend's eyes. "You think silence makes you innocent." Van Damme continued relentlessly. "It doesn't. Your silence was permission. Your laughter was encouragement. Looking away was the same as holding her down yourselves." The weight of their complicity pressed down on every chest in the corridor. Teachers who had appeared at the far end of the hall and then retreated now stood frozen, their own cowardice exposed in the harsh light of truth. Van Damme extended his hand toward Leah, who was still on her knees, breathing carefully as life returned to her body. She hesitated only a moment before sliding her trembling fingers into his steady grip. He lifted her gently, his touch radiating the protection she had craved, the safety she had been denied by everyone else in that hallway. For the first time since the nightmare began, Leah's breathing steadied. She leaned into her father's side, still clutching the crumpled photograph against her chest, drawing strength from his unwavering presence. The sight of them together, legend and daughter, protector and protected, broke something fundamental in the watching crowd. The illusion that cruelty equaled strength shattered. The comfortable lie that silence absolved guilt crumbled. The fantasy that power came from fear rather than respect died in that moment, replaced by a truth too bright to deny. Van Damme's gaze returned to Trevor, who was still slumped on the floor like a broken toy. When he spoke again, his voice carried the chill of absolute certainty. "If you ever lay a hand on her again, if you ever touch anyone weaker than you again, I will not stop at teaching you a lesson." The pause stretched like a held breath. "I will show you what real consequences feel like, and you will carry that knowledge for the rest of your life." Trevor's lips trembled, but no sound emerged. He had finally found himself face to face with genuine power, and it had revealed him to be nothing more than a frightened child playing with forces beyond his understanding. Van Damme turned back to the assembled students one final time. His words pressed into their consciousness like brands on leather, permanent and undeniable. "Remember this moment. Remember that strength is not in your fists or the fear you inspire. It comes from discipline, from control, from choosing to protect when others choose to look away." He paused, letting the lesson settle into young minds. Courage without compassion is empty. Power without purpose is meaningless. True strength lies in standing up when it would be easier to stay silent. Leah tightened her grip on his hand, feeling something new growing in her chest, not just relief or safety, but pride. For the first time in her life, she understood that she carried part of her father's strength within her, not in her fist but in her character. They began to walk toward the exit, and the crowd parted like water before them. Students lowered their heads, some in shame, others in newfound respect. No one dared lift a phone. No one whispered commentary. The silence was no longer the silence of fear or complicity. It was a reverent quiet that follows truth spoken with absolute authority. At the doors leading to the outside world, Van Damme paused one final time. Without turning around, he spoke words that would echo in that hallway long after he was gone. "Power without control is chaos. Courage without compassion is cruelty. Discipline is what gives strength meaning. The choice of what kind of person you become is always yours to make." Then he guided his daughter through the doors and into the clean morning sunlight, leaving behind a hallway forever changed by the presence of true strength. The air outside was cool and fresh, untainted by cruelty or silence. Leah breathed deeply, her throat still tender but her spirit renewed. She leaned closer to her father, understanding finally that real protection came not from hiding in shadows, but from standing in the light with those who truly loved you. Inside, the corridor remained heavy with silence long after they had gone. Students stood motionless, replaying what they had witnessed. Trevor stayed slumped against the lockers. His reign of terror ended not by another bully, but by a man who understood the difference between strength and cruelty. And everyone there knew they had seen more than a confrontation. They had witnessed a moment when true power revealed itself, when justice wore the face of a father defending his child, when a legend proved that real heroes exist not on movie screens but in the hearts of those who choose courage over comfort, protection over popularity, and love over indifference. The lesson would last forever, changing lives and perspectives in ways that would ripple through Westbrook High for generations to come.